You're listening to Biotech Hangout, a live and unedited weekly discussion of all the latest news in our industry with a group of biotech insiders. I'm Brad Loncar, and my co hosts today are Eric Schmidt and Sam Fazeli. For more information about our host and guest speakers, or to listen to the most recent episode, please go to biotechhangout.com. And I don't know if the Biotech Hangout crew tweeted this or teased this, but John Crowley was actually supposed to join us today. So we had a lot of policy issues to talk about. But sadly, he had a scheduling change and won't be with us today. But there is a lot to talk about. And Sam and Eric, it's always nice when we get M&A. It's been lacking, at least in a big way, ever since January when we had the big J&J neuro deal. But Sanofi announced that they're going to acquire Blueprint for over $9 billion. That's a pretty good deal. I'll kick it over to you guys to comment.
Eric, you go first.
Sure. Well, big picture, you're right, Brad. It's always great to have M&A in this space. This is, I think, the second largest deal we've seen after ITCI this year. So it's sizable. The premium wasn't all that big, coming in at about 27 or so percent. But I guess from my standpoint, I've been involved with this Blueprint Medicines for a while. I had the good fortune of taking them public, and I think what's great about this acquisition is this is kind of the way that biotech success stories really should play out. This company went public about 10 years ago. I think the IPO price was $18 per share. At the time, not very many of us had ever even heard of the diseases they were going after. This systemic mastocytosis sounded like Greek to me, and we came to learn that there were certainly a lot of patients suffering from this disease, both the advanced and indolent forms. And kudos to the team at Blueprint. At the time, it was led by Jeff Albers. Kate Havland has followed Jeff in his CEO shoes. And of course, Alexis Borisy has been a longtime chairperson there. They identified that there were these patients in need. They created a solution. I think they really executed to a T. And they built a ton of shareholder value, almost a 10-bagger over 10 years. So what a great ride. I mean, this is the way that biotech should play out. You should invest wisely. You should treat patients. You should bring better solutions to the world. And I guess, we're going to lose Blueprint, but the world is probably a better place because of this company's existence. So, that's what I would say here.
Yeah, I mean, Eric, I was listening to our friend Adam Feuerstein on the podcast that they do on Thursdays, and he was lamenting a little bit, or I don't know if you could call it lamenting, that we're going to lose again another company that could have been a more of a success story, therefore not getting to the future Amgens. But frankly, we seem in the biotech world to want our cake and eat it. We ask for M&A deals. When the little ones get done, we go, oh, well, that's too little. It doesn't really count. When big ones get done, we go, oh, see, there could have been an Amgen in the future. I'm not having a go at Adam, but God forbid. But it is something that I think is exactly the right thing to happen. Hopefully, fingers crossed, some of that cash gets redeployed back into the sector. I don't know, but I'm assuming that would be the case. I'm hoping that at least some of the specialists will have to do that still. And I think you're right. I've counted 11 deals on our database, M&A deals, since the beginning of the year. And then the next larger one was the Lilly's acquisition of Scorpion Therapeutics. So that was also a cancer indication. Although these guys have a cancer indication, but this is not the main driver for this asset. And what about from the perspective of Sanofi? Well, it fits rare diseases. It fits in the immunology space that they want to be the world leader in, and that is a stated hope. It gives them a possible, if consensus is right, $2 billion drug by 2030. You're paying 9.1 billion. That's not ridiculously stretched, and this I can't imagine is a low margin product in terms of the need, the way you sell it and you find the patients. I don't know. You could probably talk better to that, but it fits. well in the general story, but it's not a game changer for Sanofi. But then I suppose M&A deals generally are of this size will not be a game changer for large pharma, right? So
That's actually the thing that stood out to me, Sam. Like, I hate to say this, but Sanofi has a reputation of like paying a lot for risky things that many of which have blown up in the past, and I feel like this is a really mature deal for them. And I think probably a really good thing, and I think the timing is right as well. Just, all companies, even good ones like this that have a lot of meat on the bones, they're all valuations have been affected. So if you can strike for a pretty big deal like this at a time like this, I think it's probably pretty smart.
yeah, it would be interesting to see if there were lots of other bidders out there, because the multiple or the premium wasn't like eye-watering, right? On the other hand, $10 billion or $9.1 billion isn't bad. And I quite like the idea of this is one time where the CVRs kind of don't matter. It's $120, $29 per share, and the $2 CVR for development milestones and $4 CVR for regulatory milestones. I'm assuming most of them are achievable given how low they are. But you almost wonder why they're even there. So
All right, let's move on to the other deal. And, we could probably talk for an entire hour about all the VEGF PD-1 deals. And of course, Bristol struck and has partnered with Biotech on theirs. We recently had the Pfizer 3S Bio deal. They paid 1.25 billion upfront and up to 5 billion more. We saw some of 3S Bio's data at ASCO this past week. And also we had the huge Summit Akeso news that was, pretty controversial. I think, there was something for both bulls and bears in there. So maybe I'll start with Eric. I know I read a report that you put out, really questioning the sell-off in Summit after the Akeso news. Let's maybe start with that. Like, what was your reaction when you saw that? And of course, like the headline was that the PFS hazard ratio looked fantastic. I think it was like 0.52, but we still don't have a win on overall survival yet.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Maybe just a step back for the bigger picture here. I guess Summit and Akeso, their partner, they're kind of the granddaddy of them all in the PD-1 VEGF bispecific space. They're in the lead. They're running multiple phase 3 studies, and this is the drug ivonescimab that really started it all. Got people kind of excited about the field, and as many of you know, it's Summit and Akeso that have now worked on 2 head-to-head phase 3 studies against pembrolizumab, the world's largest pharmaceutical today, and beaten pembro head-to-head in lung cancer. So that's why the excitement is here. One remaining piece of the puzzle that we had just not seen at all before was whether the Akeso head-to-head data were going to translate into the United States. All of the big key studies have been done in China, and I thought this was by far the biggest bear case on the stock, and a reasonable one to boot. We definitely have had KOLs note that Chinese patients have different genetics, different cancer genetics in particular, and that translation from a China population to US population cannot be assured. So the news from late Friday last week, Brad, as you know, it was the HARMONi study, and it was the first data set that included not just a China population, but a US population. And in my opinion, Summit really kind of went out of their way to tell us that the 2 geographical subsets in the study had consistent data. We got to see them at the ASCO conference, spent some time with the management team, and they're pretty adamant that they've checked this box, that translation, at least in this case, which is not the largest of markets. In the case of the HARMONi study, we're talking about a second line subset of lung cancer, those that are EGFR positive. But at least in this HARMONi trial, again, management was quite adamant that there's consistency across the geographic subsets, which is what I thought investors really wanted to see. As you noted, the stock sold off, not up, but down. And I think that was because in this second line EGFR positive population, which to me is a fairly small market, the company acknowledged that it may not be able to submit for FDA approval because they've barely missed their overall survival endpoint, p equals 0.057, not statistically significant. They've spent all of their alpha at this time point, so the p-value will never be statistically significant. Even if the data mature, the p-value crosses 0.05, it'll still be a nominal p-value going forward. And yeah, I guess, the street's really, really keen to see a survival result. I'm curious, Brad, on your views here. I get that survival is important, but when we talk to people, if you have a hazard ratio for survival that's anywhere in the 0.8 range, that it seems like a strong trend. It seems like a drug that's going to be used based on very strong PFS and borderline OS. But please tell me what I'm missing.
Well, what we're missing is there's still no real conclusive hypothesis of why this combo in a bispecific should work. Roche studied VEGF and PD-1 as two separate things in combo and never really succeeded. And there's always that hypothesis out there that VEGF can kind of accelerate METs initially, or shrink tumors initially, but accelerate METs over the long term. And so without a clear hypothesis of why the bispecific is better than, why one is better than, two things together, and nobody actually hitting on OS yet, I think it's still a legitimate risk. I'm in the camp that this is all going to succeed in the end, but I do think that we're not there yet. So I do think it's a legitimate, there's a legitimate risk that's still on the table.
So I was going into this thinking the key value of this trial is not the potential to get approval and get some sales, because there's an incumbent out there called Johnson & Johnson with a different regime for post-EGFR patients. It's approved. And in fact, it is approved without an overall survival signal. Even on the second interim read, they haven't hit it yet. But it's out, it's approved. There are other drugs coming. Astra's working on a TROP2, and there are other ways that people are trying to treat this particular patient group. So I thought commercially, why would I, even if it doesn't get approved, all I was looking for was this cross read from China to, as Eric said, to the West, if you like, US. And the issue I also heard a few people say, and this is, I don't know, you want to call it misinformation, you want to call it just want to be a bear, was folks said, oh no, but even that patient group was so immature that couldn't have possibly made a difference to the HR hazard ratio. And you look at it, hang on, how's that possible? Last patient treated was in recruitment closed in August, and it had been open for 2 years, or roughly 2 years, or a year at least, a year and a half or so. So it's very possible that at least on the progression-free survival hazard ratio, there's a lot of the US patients already counted in there. Maybe on OS, you haven't had enough events in that latter group, and that perhaps it doesn't work out in the end for OS. But I was standing listening to someone telling me this, and I think people are just looking for excuses, which is natural. It was the same as people did when it was with the early days of CARVYKTI, if you remember. They were just trying to find reasons why it wouldn't work. And I'm not just here trying to parallel it to yet another Chinese asset. The issue then also ends up being that you just have to now wait till you see the actual detail. It was 0.52, Eric, versus the 0.47 or 0.46, depending on which data point you want to look at, back in China. So you can start doing some magic maths, which I hate doing because it's pretty much always wrong, to see what the hazard ratio was in the US population. And let's say it's 0.62. Why is that bad, right? So I was a bit agog at the share price reaction.
Do you guys have any thoughts on Bristol partnering with the Biotech asset specifically?
Sure. I'll kick that in, and then Eric, I'm pretty sure he has some meaningful thoughts on it too. One of the things that I always worried about the BioNTech asset, and there's another company who's got a PD-L1 VEGF, and that's Instil Bios. So on the one hand, if you took a vote around the conference, anyone you bumped into saying, is PD-1 better than PD-L1? They go, yes, because of the history of what we know, right? Keytruda Opdivo versus durvalumab and atezolizumab. Then you ask them, do you think a PD-L1 VEGF would be better than a PD-1 VEGF? Then they start getting all hypothetical. Hypothetically, PD-L1 should really be the thing that you use to target things to a tumor, which is because it's expressed on the tumor. But it always made me worried that in the background, people are going to eventually find that this ends up going down the road of other PD-L1s. So the deal kind of takes some of that risk away. I don't think it clarifies the situation, but it takes some of that risk away. And now you have the opportunity, partnered with Bristol, taking some of that cash, $3.5 billion, pretty much guaranteed to 2028, to possibly do a combo with a PD-1. I know initially you think, what, Sam? But if you think about it, if you're using the PD-L1 as a targeting molecule, and you've got the PD-1 to do its job on the T cell, there is some kind of logic. But hell, I'm not going to be designing those trials, but that's what I thought about it. And I think it was really good for BioNTech.
I think Sam's touching on something that's really important in this debate. There's just so much that we don't yet know about these drugs, these bispecifics. We know that they're interesting, active. I think we know that they're differentiated. And Brad, I'll take you up on your prior point that this could be a VEGF plus PD-1 monovalent antibody combination. It's possible, but I think we are seeing some differentiated properties here too. We're not seeing the side effects that you'd expect from systemic VEGF. We're seeing activity in squamous tumors that you wouldn't expect from VEGF on a safety profile basis. We're seeing head-to-head versus pembrolizumab activity that we wouldn't expect. We're seeing activity in second line EGFR positive patients where you wouldn't expect PD-1s to have impact. So there's a lot going on here, right? And that's why there is all this interest, whether it's from Merck or Bristol or Pfizer or others. And I just think that we're going to, need to be a little bit patient. We'll probably need to buckle up because certainly the world has shown us that Summit is going to be extraordinarily volatile as a security as we turn over some of these cards. But, over time, data will win.
And then, did you guys have a chance to see the 3S Bio poster? I didn't, but it looked like from Twitter that everything was pretty positive, and it looked genuinely impressive.
I did. So we wrote on it, Brad. So one of the first thing as an analyst that you look at when you see data updates is to compare it to the last data update. So we've got a little table that follows it from the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference 2025, the ASCO abstract. So they went from 24 patients to 25 patients in the ASCO abstract. And then the data at ASCO itself, they went up to 34 patients. So the overall response rate did soften a bit from about the 70% range to 67.5% range. I mean, is that even fair to call it softening a little bit there as you add more patients? The cutoff is March, so there's room for some of those responses. Maybe some of the stable patients might become a responder. Disease control rate remained at the top end, so nearly 100%. When you look at these, what I liked about the spider plot, one of the things that people always say about VEGF is that it's a first scan effect, so that you're getting that vasculature impact potentially on that first scan. And when you look at the Summit Akeso PFS curve, it does give you that little hint. Possibly you get a big drop on the first scan, and then it's a parallel line on the Kaplan-Meier curve of the PFS. But when you look at this data and other data from other presentations in this area in general, you see that the patients in the spider plot, the responses keep getting deeper. So this is not just about in the same patient, right? It's not just the first scan effect. Now, I'm pretty sure somebody much more knowledgeable than me can explain that in a different way and say, actually, no, Sam, it's still a first scan effect. You're wrong. I don't think so. but and it just looks pretty good. It looks like it could be one of the best out there. And you look at it in terms of the AEs. One thing I do worry about is I always look at proteinuria and hypertension in these trials, because that is the VEGF signal, right? And it's not low, 17% grade 3. No proteinuria, but 17% grade 3. I mean, this compares to a much larger data set for ivonescimab of 5% grade 3. So these molecules are different. They're not all doing the same thing. And of course, when you start looking at the Biotech one, you see even higher numbers, but it's often combined with chemo. We haven't seen many single agent BNT327 data sets. So that gets a bit complicated to try and understand. But frankly, it looked pretty decent.
All right. Well, we'll get back to ASCO in a second, but let's uh, talk about some other really interesting data that came out that's non-oncology this week. And the first one, Eric, is Vera. So that's the IgAN space. And we just had some news from a competitor company about that today at EULAR as well, right?
Yeah, what a round trip so far this week for the Vera guys. I can imagine their head spinning. So you're right, Brad. They came out on Monday of this week with what we thought are some really fantastic data in the IgAN space, the IgA nephropathy space. For those less familiar with what's going on here, IgAN has been sort of an untreatable disease for decades. Standard of care is essentially symptomatic management or non-disease modifying therapies that allow the kidney to function a little bit better, but don't reverse or retard or slow the downward progression. And all of the therapies we're about to talk about and others are operating on B cells, which it appears are fundamentally causative agents in this disease. So the folks at Vera have a drug called atacicept, and it's a BAFF/APRIL inhibitor. And the phase 3 data that they put forth earlier in the week showed wonderfully strong reductions in proteinuria, placebo adjusted, kind of in the low 40s. We already know from previous data sets that atacicept also does slow, if not completely, retard the degradation of kidney function in patients. So they've got a very comprehensive data set. And with this phase 3 result that came out on Monday, they intend to file for approval toward the end of the year. Meanwhile, a competitor just on the tape today, Otsuka, with their drug Saprenolol, this is an APRIL-only inhibitor, so very related in its mechanism. We're not quite sure whether there's benefit to inhibition of both BAFF/APRIL in addition to APRIL, but at least in preclinical models, the dual inhibitor does look a little bit better. Nonetheless, Otsuka has some, again, very solid data of its own. If anything, they're showing proteinuria data that's a little bit better in terms of absolute magnitude of reduction than atacicept from Vera. I don't think you can make a comparative efficacy claim on that. I will take issue with our friend at Stat News who published that the Otsuka data were better. I don't see that in the database. I think there are some baseline variables that confound any such analysis. And honestly, what kidney patients care about and what doctors care about isn't whether you have lower protein in the urine. It's whether over time your disease is more stable in terms of downward progression of kidney function. And again, that's data that Vera has, and so far at least Otsuka doesn't. So bottom line, these are both going to be, I think, very quickly embraced and widely embraced therapies for IgAN patients. We think this is a huge market. We think it's probably a $15 or billion plus kind of an opportunity. So I feel for the folks at Vera who had some wonderful data and now are maybe playing defense and in an area where, again, we've talked about this before on this show. There is no usual one winner take all phenomenon in biotech. We're probably going to talk about this when we talk about Bicara and Mera in a few minutes. This IgAN space certainly big enough for two players, and I think both companies are going to make a lot of money here. But Brad, Sam, I don't know if you guys have additional thoughts.
I mean, I would just say, like, I always want to be careful about like talking about M&A, but that's kind of the Vera story. Is as you pointed out, this is a huge market, and when I see data like this that is trying to compare two different companies, well, I think about like potentially commercially one day, what would this drug look like in the hands of a much bigger pharmaceutical company, especially given what a huge market that is. So I think that Vera's having a pretty good week. I don't know what will happen with them, of course, but I would say to be as competitive as they are in this space puts them in a really good position. And as you know, there's been a lot of deals like in the nephrology space over the last like couple of years. It's definitely an area of increased focus for the larger companies.
Yeah, Brad, I just wanted to add something, not specifically on this, but I know how I feel. I can almost sense you two being, I'm not going to say that is the case, but we're all exhausted from ASCO. But actually, we've had a pretty exciting week, and I think that maybe our I don't know if others are hearing us as enthusiastic and infused, but I just want to make sure that folks listening are not thinking that, because we've got it's a week that started with two deals essentially, right? One much bigger than the other. We've had ton of good data. Some share price moves in the wrong direction, but some in the to up, and and the XBI, for however much we love it or hate it, is meaningfully up in the week, and also since it's low. So I just want to make sure that I suspect that we're going to go and talk about the all the magic of stuff that we've seen at ASCO, but I want to make sure
Yeah,
people don't walk away thinking, "Oh God, this is not a very these guys are all down in the mouth."
well, yeah, and in fact, I'll take that handoff real quick and transition to our next piece of data that I thought was super exciting, and I would say like one thing that biotech always needs is like a new technology to get really excited about. I think the PD-1 by VEGF and just like the whole bispecific space is turning into that. And one new technology that I'm really excited about, if you think about it like really in the first inning, is protein degradation. So Arvinas, weeks ago had the first ever phase 3 trial of like readout of a PROTAC, and the market viewed it as disappointing because it was a breast cancer trial and they degraded estrogen receptor and it only worked in a subset of patients, but it was a successful phase 3 trial for 40% of this particular breast cancer group. And then I think really exciting, Chimera had an announcement on Monday, and this is just healthy volunteer data, but they're big believers in the STAT6 target. And the whole idea here, and really the whole idea of this class, is to have like a new modality that you can especially make potentially simple oral therapy. So the idea here is like a once daily oral competitor to Dupixent. And so they had data, again, healthy volunteer data. So we have to see, how it translates into people with, actual inflammatory diseases. But from doses at 1.5 mgs and up, and they went to like 200 mgs, like some like huge number, but like from 1.5 and up, they had 90% degradation. And they had a real clean safety profile, and even in biomarkers that you look for about like potentially treating diseases, which is pretty tricky in healthy volunteers because by definition they don't have the disease, but the Th2 biomarkers, they saw really nice reductions in TARC and exotaxin 3 and like other biomarkers that would suggest that this might work in actual patients. So they've already moved to the phase 1b portion of this. So we'll see actual atopic derm patient data sometime like in the fourth quarter towards the end of the year. And now they're moving it into other things like asthma. So I think it's I think that protein degradation, I'm a big believer in it. I think that that's going to be a technology that we have that could, add some real excitement, to the biotech sector over the coming years. It's very early, and like any technology, there's going to be ups and downs. And I guess you could argue that we saw that with the Arvinas data. But in terms of like something new like around the corner, I think it's something to be excited about.
Yeah, look,
And
Brad, I think you're absolutely right, because it gives you a whole new set of targets to work with that may not be amenable to standard enzyme inhibition, if you like, right? And it just opens such a big window of opportunity, assuming you can get the molecule design right and the pharmacology right. So it is and absolutely, I think it's going to be a cornerstone of future drug development.
for sure. And ironically, on the exact same day, Nurix struck a Stat6 deal with Sanofi, and actually Nurix will have BTK data at EHA next week, and we already saw we already saw Beijing have BTK data at the last ASH, so I think it's something to watch closely. But
Yeah.
let's go back to ASCO, and Eric, why don't I'm going to start with you. Like, what were your just like overall impressions? Was this like an up year, a down year, or kind of like middle of the road?
Yeah, I'll come back to Sam's comments. I hope that our tiredness, I mean, I'm just exhausted. It seems like this week won't ever end. But I hope that our listeners are not interpreting that as anything but a wonderful week for biotech and a wonderful week for oncology. I think in terms of ASCO, maybe you could say it was a down year in terms of there not being any major headlines, big game-changing clinical trial results that we were previously not aware of. Certainly, there were some game-changing results. I'm sure Sam might want to talk about Trodelvy, et cetera. But what I thought was the real theme here was just how much innovation was ongoing. Maybe a lot of that in small cap biotech, maybe a lot of that in earlier stage data sets. But this innovation kind of creeps up on you. I think both of you are old enough to know that when we used to talk about pancreatic cancer or melanoma or some of these really, really difficult to treat tumors, we used to say, wow, this company's got a 7% response rate, a 12% response rate. That's the best we've ever seen. That's an active drug. And now in some of these tumor types like pancreatic or melanoma, we're kind of sticking our nose up at response rates in the 20s, 30s, even 40% on occasion. So things have changed. And even at this ASCO in particular, I'll point out some newer targets in pancreatic and melanoma that I think are going to continue to be game changers. Everyone knows in pancreatic cancer, the KRAS inhibitors, Revolution Medicines kind of leading the charge there. But a new target I think is emerging that we're increasingly excited about. It's PRMT5. It's being pioneered by Bristol, Amgen to a certain extent. Maybe Tango could be one of the emerging leaders in this space as well. And the data from Bristol at ASCO are showing about a 25% response rate in pancreatic cancer, which again is a tumor type that's never really seen any meaningful success other than the KRAS inhibitors. So that's highly, highly encouraging. And I think we'd love to see that combined with a KRAS inhibitor, a PRMT5 plus KRAS, and just see how far this presumably fairly well tolerated targeted combination can go. And then on the melanoma side, one thing that struck me was the Imatix data. This is a European company that's pioneering a PRAME-directed TCR cell therapy. Brad, I know you love the cell therapy space, and I'm sure you were very, very happy to see that they've got response rates in refractory melanoma. Again, an indication where we're used to saying something in the 20% range might be interesting. They've got a 55% response rate in those patients. It looks quite durable now with follow-up out to over a year. And there's a lot of excitement and enthusiasm for their phase 3. All of the KOLs were really raving about this candidate, that at least those that we spoke to. So great to see that innovation, and it does sneak up on you. And sometimes, being away from ASCO, you kind of come back after a few years and say, wow, this is why we do this job.
And Sam, I think if you had to declare a winner of ASCO, probably most people bets would have been on Astra, and of course, in HER2 with their partner Daiichi Sankyo had another important year in breast cancer. Tell us about Astra's ASCO.
Yeah, I mean, look, Brad, I hear people go, "Oh, this is not a very exciting ASCO to go to," and then we all come back with all these new molecules, PRMT5 that Eric just spoke to, the evolving data for the KRAS, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit, and then here you get, trials that are going into tumors that have not necessarily had the best of luck so far, pancreatic being one of them. So I'll start off by saying this felt another ASCO, or at least one of the key players was Astra. Seven years in a row that they get a plenary, and they're very happy to keep highlighting that. No standing ovation, though. I was sitting next to a friend of ours who's on the Y side, and they were looking for a standing ovation, and they didn't get it this time. But lots of clapping. So what did we get? We got Imfinzi in the Matterhorn study in gastric cancer, really unprecedented event-free survival benefit. So that was really, I think, pretty much ready to give you that practice changing setup. And then you got in HER2 for first line HER2 positive setting in the Destiny Bristol 9 trial. That also seemed to suggest that it's opening up another significant patient population or opportunity. And of course, as Eric's highlighted, Trodelvy in the Ascento 4 trial, first-line PD-L1 positive triple-negative breast cancer combined with Keytruda, really pretty impressive PFS hazard ratio of 0.65. So, and then you add that to the Ascento 3 data that we had in PD-L1 negative patients, the results really do suggest a meaningful opportunity here for Gilead Trodelvy in that space. So breast cancer, a lot of, when I want to talk to folks outside saying, look, cancer is cure, everyone says, is there a cure? I'm just saying there are now people with myeloma or breast cancer who live long enough to die of something else. If you can't call that cure, I don't know what you're looking for, right? And I'm just hoping melanoma is the same, right? I'm just hoping that the same will start happening with some of these other tumors. And the early data that we see at ASCO is what gives us hope that we're going to get there.
Yeah, and I would echo, I think Gilead had a really good ASCO. I mean, this is their biggest ASCO in years and years. And, Trodelvy is really starting to bloom. I mean, these breast cancer indications that they're succeeding in now are a really big deal. And, let's not forget that cell therapy is cooking too. Like Kite now is like $2 billion a year revenue for them, which is really amazing. A lot of critics, would have never predicted that. And I'd also say that I don't feel like we talked a lot about cell therapy at this year's ASCO, but they had some interesting brain cancer data that I thought was kind of fascinating. And but getting back to Trodelvy, one thing that really stood out to me as I was thinking about that is look at all of the investments that they bought that asset for over $20 billion, and look at the roller coaster that has been. And one thing that I kind of thought of, just kind of thinking of the long road of how they've taken it from where it was to where it is now, really accelerating. I don't think a smaller company could have done that. Um, with some of the clinical trial setbacks and the changes that they had to make and the amount of money that they've invested in the development program like that, I think it really makes an argument of, the value of scale and big companies for certain assets. And so I think they deserve a lot of credit for always being full speed ahead on Trodelvy when a lot of critics, maybe us included, at times were really critical of that deal and their development program. Sam, speaking of Astra, one of the companies that I interviewed for Biotech TV was Arcus, and they had their HIF2 alpha data at ASCO. But I know one thing that we were talking about kind of on the sidelines is the whole TIGIT, field. And all of the disappointments that we've seen there lately. You know, Roche, of course, had the big skyscraper miss. A lot of companies have divested of their programs. You know, Beijing did recently. We just had Itios literally close shop about a week ago. And interestingly, there's two companies that are full speed ahead on TIGIT. So one of them is Astra, and they're specifically doing bispecifics, and then the other one is Arcus. And I think it's setting up to be like potentially a fascinating story because there's something that those two things have in common, which is that both of those programs are FC silent. And I know both companies like strongly believe that that's you know, a huge factor that you know, makes them day and night different. What's your take on? I think Astra now has like 10
Yeah.
10 key studies like going full steam
Yeah.
ahead, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, Brad, I'm a simple person. So when I think about having an FC active on a molecule that binds to a T cell, it just worries me a little bit, right? You think, well, why would I want antibody directed cytotoxicity against the T cell? So that's the only argument I find that having the FC, and maybe you can also manage the side effects a bit better if you didn't have the FC active. But in terms of Astra, I mean, they're really putting their money where their mouth is, right? They've got 10 trials. What have I got here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in non-small cell lung cancer, 2 in biliary tract, 1 in HCC, hepatocellular, 1 endometrial, and 1 gastric. And what's interesting here, so this adds up to about 8,000 patients, all phase 3s, right? 10 trials. So they have seen a signal, and Susan Galbraith talks about this signal that they had a poster on at SITC, which unfortunately it's the one conference I didn't go to this year, and the one that probably had that one little interesting nugget at it. And that they're seeing an interferon gamma signature response in some of the patients that are, I don't know the full story. I need to see the poster. The reality is that they presented 2 sets of data, and just by the way, and these out of these 10, only one of them is monotherapy, and this is not monotherapy, right? This is bispecific. This is PD-1 TIGIT. So the rest are Dato, which is TROP2. So it brings you back to the thinking about, well, what, you know, what could, how could that play out for Gilead, given that they've got the access to the Arcus drug? As far as I remember, they must have given up, right? I don't know if they've given up. You'd remind me. I'm getting a
They have
blank
not.
here. They have
Yeah, no,
not
they
given
have.
up. There you go.
They've. Yeah,
So can you imagine a combo of Trodelvy plus a TIGIT if one of these trials reads out? And they have TDXD, so Enhertu in combo. They've got chemo. They've got bevacizumab plus tremelimumab. In fact, that's their answer. Every time somebody asks them, "Why did you get a PD-1 VEGF?" They go, "Well, we're actually doing a tremelimumab, you know, a bevacizumab plus a you know, in the hepatocellular carcinoma setting." So the data they presented was on this the drug called rilvegostomig, right? I have to say, looked pretty decent when I'm looking at the lung cancer data that they showed. I think TROPION-Lung04. We had 71% ORR in the PD-L1 high patients, 40% in the negative patients, right? And then all the cuts surpassed monotherapy results that we saw, surpassed rilvegostomig monotherapy results that we saw. Of course, you have to watch out for adverse events, right? As soon as you put TROP2 in there, a whole bunch of new adverse events come along, stomatitis being the one that really upsets people. 53% was the rate in the trial. So how this panned out into the phase 3s, I don't know. And then they had the biliary tract cancer trial, the Gemini data, which was a combo with versus with Imfinzi, and they showed a higher objective response rate here, 31%, only slightly, versus the I think it was the Topaz trial, if I remember correctly. And so again, another positive signal on pretty much every line. And then, of course, now it's BTCs in 2 trials in phase 3. So the signals are there. Astra's going for it, and we're going to see the real outcome of all this in from 2026 or 2027, I think, as the data, as the trials read out.
All right.
Maybe this is how AZ is going to win ASCO 2026, 2027, 2028, and beyond. Who knows,
But no,
right?
I
Brad,
think 26 will probably be Avanza, right? Which is Trop2
love,
plus yeah. IO.
Brad, love your thoughts on the Arcus HIF alpha that you mentioned. It looked pretty good to me. Do you think it's differentiated?
Yeah, well, I think it's almost like the IgAN discussion we just had. I think it's potentially such a huge market that if they're second and even just comparable, I think it's a huge market and a huge opportunity for them. And I do think that it like their data looks slightly better than Merck's right now, and people really like this asset because, of course, you have a validated target that's on the market right now, and I would say if we were talking 2 years ago, everyone would have said that TIGIT was Arcus's main program. And, given all the volatility that's had and, given how Marcus succeeded with HIF2 alpha, I think for sure that the HIF2 alpha is now Arcus's main program. And I think it's super interesting. I'm going to move on to
Brad, can I
some.
just correct myself very quickly here, just for perfection's sake? The Gemini trial is rilvegostomig plus chemotherapy in HER2 negative BTC. That's
Right.
it.
I'm going to move on. Eric alluded to it earlier, but something that was like a really interesting bull bear debate at ASCO. And, I always preface this by saying we're rooting for everyone's success. Like, obviously, in our industry, the companies themselves are, we want patients to succeed. But, the reality of our business is that we do have competition. And I think the big competition at this year's ASCO was Maris versus Bicara. So this is head and neck cancer, which traditionally is a very difficult cancer to treat, and the checkpoint inhibitors by themselves have very low response rates. And so we definitely need something new. And these two programs are slightly different. So Bicara is a fusion protein that's EGFR by TGF beta, and Maris is like more of a traditional bispecific antibody that's EGFR by LGR5. So, Eric, I'll pass it over to you. I don't know if you cover both of these companies or just one, but I'm interested to know like what your thought is on this like potential competition.
Yeah, and I think, thanks, Brad. We covered just Bicara, and I think the theme of our discussion today is this, I don't know, fight to the death competitive match between drugs in the same class. And, Wall Street, we always like to pick a winner. We always like to think we're capable of picking a winner, and we always like to think that it's a winner-take-all battle. That's rarely how these markets play out. We can go back to our discussion of IgAN or the discussion we just had on HIF alpha. Now we're heading into a similar discussion on the frontline head and neck cancer marketplace, which is a big market, probably a $3 or $4 billion market. There's a real disconnect here between what the doctors are saying and what investors are saying. So physicians are much more even-handed in their views toward these two molecules. They're saying that both are pretty much off the charts, better than anything we've seen before. We've got response rates in the 50, 60% for both of these molecules on top of Keytruda in the frontline head and neck cancer setting. And that's about 3 times the response rate you would expect from Keytruda alone. So this is, coming back to our other theme of the day, major innovation in the cancer space. Both companies are now in phase 3. Maris is a little bit ahead, and Maris certainly has some potential competitive differentiation that might become an advantage for it. On the other hand, the street has accorded Maris essentially, winner-take-all status in this battle. Maris has a market valuation of around $4+ billion, and Bicara, much like Arcus, I think Brad, Marcus is trading a little bit below its cash balance. Bicara is trading a little bit above its cash balance, but generally these two companies getting very little credit for having competitive entrance in the space. And we think the Bicara molecule, ficerafusp, which as you called out, hits not just EGFR, but TGF beta. We think it is looking differentiated itself in ways that might be positive from a competitive standpoint. The depth of response and duration of response here look very good to me. So Sure. You can certainly buy the class, and the class is probably undervalued in some of these competitive battles. But markets have a way of kind of evening out over time, and we're hopeful that Bicara will get its due. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think, Eric, one of the things that people are questioning about Bicara is the Maris one seems to be working in both HPV negative and HPV positive. And I know HPV positive is a much smaller indication, but people are just kind of maybe using that as like a benchmark for comparing the two. Like if one is working in both patient populations and one company seems to have pretty much abandoned, that HPV positive group, maybe that says something about the strength of their assets. What do you think about that argument?
That's a great point to make. Thank you for bringing it up. Interestingly, we talk about head and neck cancer as head and neck cancer, but physician experts these days increasingly think about it as you just parsed out, HPV positive and negative disease, and almost view these two disease states as very different, as if they're different histologies, different tumor types altogether. And you're right, it is true that Bicara has selected the HPV negative subset. It actually has very good biologic rationale for pursuing HPV negative patients. That's based on preclinical data and now increasingly translational data in the clinic to support the use of not only the EGFR aspect of the molecule, but also the TGF-beta aspect, and to why molecularly, mechanistically, this makes sense to go after HPV-negative tumors. So I'm a big believer that they've actually, turned what could be a negative into a positive by selecting out the patients that are most appropriate for their therapy. This may be where we do see some differences. The Maris molecule doesn't work through TGF-beta. It may be active in HPV-positive patients, but it also may not be as active in HPV-positive patients. So again, we've got something to learn here, and probably not going to be a one-size-fits-all market.
I just want to mention, I did 15 interviews throughout the 4 days of ASCO for Biotech TV, and the one I did with the CEO of Bicara, Claire Mazumdar, was actually my favorite because, this is, I've always been a big believer that the best CEOs, just like the best leaders in our in our industry, period, everyone wants to do media when things are terrific and going great, and not to say that she had a bad ASCO, or even that the competitive, as you're hearing now, there's an argument to be made, a strong argument to be made for this, but it was controversial, and especially doing video, is a whole different, it's a whole different thing too, and people get nervous, about maybe saying the wrong thing on video or whatever, and she came and really stood up for herself and her company and for her data, and we had a good, I think, balanced discussion about it. And I brought up, a lot of the bear arguments and everything, and I'll let viewers decide on the substance of the answers and everything. But I thought she did just a terrific job of being out there and being visible at a time when her stock price wasn't so great after they put out the abstracts, and analysts, some analysts were kind of really being hard on this comparison and everything. So I just want to give her credit, and just kind of point out that that's what really true leaders do. So credit to her for doing that, and I thought it was a great discussion. We only have a couple minutes left. It's probably good. Sadly, it would have been great to have him on, but as I mentioned at the start, we almost had John Crowley on today, and given everything that we've talked about, I don't know how we would have fit in all of the policy stuff that's been going on. But I think maybe we'll just briefly touch on one. So there was a big cell and gene therapy meeting, and of course, everyone is wondering with Vinay Prasad, some of the previous things that he said about some gene therapies like Sarepta and things like that, what the FDA's stance is going to be on some of those types of emerging technologies. Did either of you guys see any of like that meeting or any of the comments out of it, and do you have any thoughts?
Well, I guess I'll start. I mean, I actually had the benefit of speaking with John this week. We did host Mr. Crowley on a Cantor webinar, so I know he was at the meeting. And for those of us who are listening in, I think we all came to the same conclusion, which is right now we're hearing great things from the FDA. I want to emphasize hearing because talk is cheap, and we still need to see the follow through. And there are still, in my opinion, some concerns about staff and resourcing that need to be addressed. But wow, I don't think the FDA could have had a better week either, right? They came out not just at that meeting, Brad, but the day before, Dr. Macri made some comments that were well received. I know he was also at a conference on Wall Street saying pretty much exactly what investors wanted to hear, which is he's pro-innovation, he's pro an efficient registrational and regulatory body, and we're not going to be, maybe going back into the dark ages as far as wiring back some of the progress that we made under the prior administrations.
I saw a comment in the news too. I think it might have actually been his own tweet. I saw RFK commented on the base editing, the UPenn baby that happily went home this week as well. So I thought that was like a good, like you said, words, but a good vote of confidence in just like the whole gene editing field. So maybe that's a positive. And then, of course, I'm sure everyone's seen this. The FDA also had like they're trying to meet with like, the CEOs of companies in the industry. They had their first one in the DC area. I know they're headed to the Bay Area and San Diego, and around biotime, they're going to have one here in Boston as well. So I'm sure that some details of those meetings will start trickling out as they start happening. So maybe we'll get a little more clarity on just kind of their relationship with the industry and like our industry's ability to give them feedback on, what's really affecting us and what's important to us.
And not to end today's session on a down note, because it has been so wildly positive in so many different ways this week, Sam. You're right to call that out earlier in the call, but John did mention that we're still not in a good place with MFN. We may be in a better place with the FDA. I think we're all feeling pretty good about that. But where bio really does need our support, and where I hope all of our listeners will stand up and join hands and fight for the industry that we all love and believe in, is on the drug pricing side, where unfortunately things have not progressed as favorably maybe as the regulatory bodies or other topics that we're talking about this week.
I guess Eric and Brad, I think we're also all holding our breaths, hopefully not for much longer, on the tariff front, right? I don't know how much longer that would take. I don't know how much time a 232 investigation has. It might take several months, from what I understand. So you've got that still hanging over our heads, but the MFN is the bigger one, and how it gets implemented. Let's just remember that we've just had a week of great cancer data, and some pancreatic cancer patients, hopefully in a few years, will be sitting in a world where you're looking at second line and third line therapies which are active. That would be great.